Yes, hello and good afternoon. Welcome to this second session in the hybrid workshop, Regional Economics of Migration. It's a pleasure for me to chair the second session. Thanks to the colleagues from CFE for giving us the opportunity. My name is Thomas Liebing, and I'm leading the work on integration of migrants in ELS, in the Employment, Labor and Social Affairs Directorate of the OECD. So we're going to have two issues that we're going to be looking at in this the second session. The first on decomposing the impact of immigration on house prices, and the second on the trade creating effect of immigrants. So we start with a first presentation by Rosa Sanchís-Guarner from University of Barcelona, who's going to be joining us remotely. The rules are the same as before. The presentation should be 20 minutes max, and we have 10 minutes for the discussions, and then we have Q&A for 10 minutes. And I will be very strict in time if the presenter goes above the 20 minutes, because then we would be pity to be cutting short on the discussion. So voila, Rosa, over to you.
Okay, can you hear me okay? Yes? Okay. So I apologize for not being there. I thank the organizers for inviting me, and I'm gonna share my screen. So I apologize, you're gonna be seeing the side of my face because I'm gonna be looking at my other screen. So yeah. Okay, so thank you for inviting me. I'm gonna present a paper looking at the impact of immigration on house prices, which hopefully will clarify some of the issues I found when I was researching on this topic. So there's no need to motivate this research in this context, but everyone knows that immigration inflows across countries are still very large. We can just think about the recent refugee waves in countries in war, the wave between Colombia and Venezuela, and the effects of these immigration inflows on different local outcomes dominate still the political and the policy discourse in many countries. So with this in mind, the local impacts effects of immigrants is still a very active area of research, as some of the papers presented today show, but this research has been mostly concentrated in the effective labor markets, given the importance that this might have, looking at average employment or wages, occupational changes, effects on natives, etc., etc. But as raised by Borjas in 2003, there's an issue when we estimate average area effects, that is that the mobility of the incumbent population, the natives living in these areas, might confound the way the coefficients. So sometimes we might find very small or zero effects just because the entry of immigrants is assumed to be pushing natives away from these areas. In terms of the literature on the effect of immigration on prices, there's a small literature on the effects on consumption goods prices, started by Lack and Patricia Cortez in the late 2000s, where basically there's three channels through which immigrants affect prices. They increase demand, they increase the search of cheap products, and they provide cheaper labor. So in general, there's been negative effects estimated on consumption goods prices. However, housing is a different type of good because it's inelastic and it's non-tradable. So we can expect that an immigrant inflow can have different effects. So it will immediately increase the size of the local population for a given native population in the area. So this might increase demand and competition for housing units, pushing prices up. But we have to take into account that immigrants and natives might consume different types of housing. So natives might live in overcrowded houses, or they might consume less quality housing. Also, immigrants can have a depressing effect on house prices by providing cheaper labor. And finally, we have to think that natives might change their location because of these immigrants. And in general, it's believed that immigration inflows might, it will lead to native flight. So if we can, it has been systematized in the literature that there's three ways we can think that an immigration wave might affect local average house prices. First, there's a direct increase in prices due to the increased demand. So basically, it's an automatic effect that for a given housing stock and a given stock of native population, more people will compete to consume this housing good, and prices will go up almost automatically. I'm going to call this the partial. There's going to be additional changes in prices because population might relocate as a consequence or as a reaction to the immigration inflow. And finally, there's going to be changes in housing supply. It can be on the quantity, on the composition, and on the tenure. With these three channels in mind, there's been research that has looked at the impact of immigration on house prices, basically started by Albert Seitz in 2003 and 2007. And a number of papers have estimated the effect of immigration on prices mostly, and some on rents for a myriad of countries. And they have generally found positive effects, except Sa, who in 2015, which is a paper that has been a bit rebutted, where she finds a negative impact because natives fly more than proportionate to the immigration. What we can see from the revision of the literature is that the spatial scale matters. So it's very clear, or it's quite established, that there's going to be native flight in a very small spatial scale. So in certain neighborhoods, there's a lot of concentration of immigrants. We've been found that natives tend to leave those areas, but when we aggregate the spatial scale up, the evidence is not so clear. The way this research is done is looking at the total impact with some sort of share IP. So the impact mixes the three channels I just described: the increase in demand from natives, the changes in demand from the increase in demand from the new immigrants, change in demand from the natives, and the changes in supply. So when I was working on this paper, I found there was some sort of confusion about what we call the long and short-term adjustments and what is called the total of partial effects. So in general, most of these papers, they discuss these three channels, or initially Albert Seitz in 2007 discussed the existence of these three channels of adjustment, but they don't actually estimate them separately, and they interpret the fact that you find a positive effect, this as an evidence of the absence of native displacement, of the absence of a very substantial native. So what I do in this paper is to look at how prices adjust to immigration inflows, looking specifically at the different channels. I'll first provide a formal decomposition of the impact, which clarifies the relationship between the total and the partial effects. And then I propose a method to estimate this in the data using the Spanish case. I'm going to use the Spanish provinces during the period 2001 to 2011, which is a good setting because this is a period where immigration grew massively in Spain. It increased. We all had almost 5 million people inflows of immigrants, and the share of foreign-born population increased from 2 to 12%, more or less. And at the same time, we had an immense housing boom up to 2009, and then a housing bust from 2009, which is going to provide a lot of house price variation. So what I find is that conditional on supply conditions. So I'm going to be trying to parcel out everything that relates to supply, so I can focus on the demand adjustments. I find that a 1 percentage point increase in the immigration rate is going to increase average house prices by 3.3%, which is very similar to previous estimates in the literature, including estimates for the US. But when I estimate the partial demand estimates, which is, I'm going to explain in detail what I refer to as partial demand estimates, these are going to be lower than 25% lower than total estimates. And this is going to be due to the immigrants and natives located in the same provinces, which is somehow surprising, at least to the many referees I had in this paper. But it's quite robust, and I try to explain both with a model and with some empirical evidence why it might be the case for the Spanish case. Okay, so I'm going to discuss briefly the decomposition, how I do it in just one slide. There's full details in the paper, then the methodology in the discussion of the results, and some conclusion. Okay, so for a local population, so an incumbent population in an area, and a given housing supply, there's going to be an inflow. Any change in the local population, if supply doesn't react, is going to increase demand and potentially prices. But these changes in local population they're going to be obviously correlated with local housing conditions. So there's problems of endogeneity. Exogenous variation on total population, so immigrations and natives at the same time, are very difficult to have. To put it mildly, it's basically very, very difficult to have, impossible to have a good instrument for total population. However, we can have credible instruments that can be discussed of immigration inflows. So one thing we can do is to use the variation driven by immigration inflows to capture changes in local population. So the idea is that we can instrument population with exogenous foreign-born location, and in areas where natives, let's say native natural growth is very slow, a lot of the variation in local population is going to be driven or is going to be caused by exogenous shocks by this immigration. What happens is that these immigration inflows not only increase the numbers immediately when they arrive, they're also going to affect the mobility of natives. So even if the incumbents' natural growth of population is not high, there's going to be local changes in the natives because these move due to the immigration inflows. Okay, so this makes us want to think in a way that we're going to have partial effects. We capture the impact of changes in demand, keeping other factors. So the partial effect is going to capture the change in demand due to the immigration wave only, so the demand from the new arrivals, while we think about housing supply and native mobility being fixed. And the total effect is going to capture the changes in prices that are the combination of the changes in the direct demand from the immigrants, plus any additional changes that occur due to the native relocation. And I'm going to call this induced demand. I'm going to formalize this in an equation in the next slide, so I hope it becomes clear enough. Okay. So how do we formalize this? I start with these three equations. The first one has the growth of local house prices in region I at time t as a function of population growth and some other factors, and the error term. The second term is just an identity that states that the growth in population is just the sum of the growth in foreign-born and the growth in native population. And the last one is what is being called the native displacement test, which basically tests the changes in native population as a function of the changes in the foreign-born. These changes in native and foreign-born population are going to be normalized by total population in the area, and these are going to be native and foreign-born rates. Okay, so in the paper it's done in detail, but I combine this equation and I take the empirical counterparts and make some assumptions about the correlation of the errors with the confounders. So assuming that I can consistently estimate the equations, I find the following relations. So beta 1 estimated is going to be the total demand change, which is going to be the sum of two demand effects. The first one is going to be the direct demand effect, which corresponds to the demand from the natives. And the second one is going to be the product of, it's going to be a demand coefficient, a direct demand coefficient. And the second one is going to be the induced demand, which is a product of beta 3 and beta 2, which depends on beta 2. And what is beta 3 is the reaction of natives to an immigration inflow. So we look at the second term of this equation, we see that the total effect is the demand coefficient, beta 2, multiplied by 1 plus beta 3. If beta 3, so we can have several scenarios. If natives don't react to immigration inflows, then the total and the partial effects are the same. If they do react and they fly, but less than proportionally, we will still have an increase in demand. So beta 2 will be, beta 1 will be larger than beta 2. And if they fly more than proportionally, the term in brackets will be negative. and will have a partial effect that's smaller than the total. Okay, so what we can do is to identify the population changes driven by immigration, which in our case is going to be the main source of population changes, because the natural growth in this area, the natural population growth in the area was very low, and this was a period with high immigration. Okay. So in the paper, there's the three equations I estimate to try to, I want to estimate the three coefficients in the decomposition. The first one is the impact of foreign-born on house prices, which is beta 1, which corresponds to the total effect. The second term is going to be the effect of the direct demand effect, which is beta 2. I will explain in a minute how I identify this. And the last one,
to let you know that you just have 5 minutes left.
Okay, I didn't realize. Okay, and the last one is going to be the native mobility equation. So I control with a series of fixed effects and observables, and I use a shift share instrument, which is a combination of the shares in 1991 and shifts which are based on a prediction model, on a gravity model on push factors. Okay, just going to speed up a little bit. I'm going to skip this. So the OLS results are the following. So we find that by adding different sets of controls in the last column, I find that an increase of 1% in the immigration rate leads to a 2% increase in prices. And when I instrument it, which is the column 1 of this table, I find that the coefficient instrumented is larger, which means that the OLS was downward biased. So conditional on under controls, the immigrants seem to be going to areas where prices are growing slower, which would make sense because they can normally afford cheaper houses. Okay. In the second equation here, using the instrument, I find that there's a positive effect of natives and immigration rates. So for each 10 natives that go into a region, there's 3 natives that collocate in the same region, which is, let's say, an unusual effect or a non-expected effect, but it has been found before in the literature, and it is explained in the paper with a complementarity model. Okay, and in equation 4, what I do is to estimate the partial effect. So how do I pin down the partial effect? The idea is that I want to capture only the changes in population that are due to the immigration wave. So I basically use population rate as my regressor, and I instrument it with the immigration shift share IV, okay, which is showing this in this equation. So then I sort of clean up the total effect from the effect in changes in induced demand from natives. And actually, if I combine these 3 coefficients, so this is beta 1, this is beta 3, and this is beta 2 in the equation, I find that the decomposition I showed you before holds exactly in the data. Okay, so this is just the same I just said in words. Okay, the final total impact of 3.3, but this is driven when I decompose this into the partial and the induced demand effects. I find that the partial demand is 2.5%. So this is very similar to a raw demand coefficient, and the additional demand from relocated natives is around 0.0. Okay, there's a series of robustness checks in the paper that looked at the validity of the IV. So I'm going to skip this one. This is basically some sort of placebo instruments where I use other shares and other shifts, and I find that the results are, except for this one, where the weak instruments test is very low, but still, most of them seem that if I use different placebo shares or placebo shifts, I find no effect. Okay. However, if I use alternative instruments constructed with shifts and shares, I do expect to predict immigration. I find that my results are very robust. Okay. I'm just going to show you this, and I will conclude in a minute. Most of the results of the paper are done for house prices because there's the private market and the prices can adjust to changes in demand. I did do the results on rents, which basically are the following. So the total effect is around 1%, and the partial effect is around 0.75%, which are much lower than for prices, and this is not unexpected because rents, the data I have for rents is the average price. It's not this, let's say, the contract price or the demand price from new leases, and this includes a growth in rents that are linked to the national CPI. So there's very little variation in these results. So I find that these effects are much lower, even though we would have expected them to be bigger because immigrants tend to rent more than to rent houses. And this is basically due to data limitations. Okay, so to conclude, what this paper does is to draw attention to a highly overlooked issue in the estimation of average area effects of immigration, is the role of local population relocation. When there's a wave of immigration, how the local population reacts, and this affects the estimates. And we need to understand what is the direct impact and the induced impact on local demand and prices. One of the main contributions is to establish a formal decomposition that clarifies the interpretation of the coefficients into partial and total demand estimates. So the partial estimates are those where we keep mobility and housing supply fixed, and total demand allows for changes in native mobility. And the main takeaways are three. Partial and total demand effects can differ substantially if the effect of native mobility is sizable. My equation doesn't predict in which direction this will go. I find in the case of Spain, we have collocation and the total effects are larger than the partial effects, but that's not necessarily the case. It depends on how natives are reacting. I find that actually in the Spanish case, they do collocate in the same provinces, possibly due to production consumption complementarities, which is something I discuss further in the paper. And the last takeaway is that it's important to consider the impact of population mobility when evaluating any area-based phenomena or something or policy, because it might confound the interpretation of the coefficients into a total or partial effect. Thank you. I hope on time.
Thank you very much, Rosa. That was perfect on time.
Okay.
A very interesting presentation on this very key issue of the impact of immigration on houses, as you said.
Do you want me to keep the slides up or for questions, or should I just answer?
No, because I think the commenter with the discussing also.
Oh yeah, of course.
Okay, so I hand over to our colleague Gabriel Chavez-Bosch, who will give some comments first before we open the general discussion.
All right. Thank you very much, Rosa, for this presentation on this very interesting paper, and for the organizers for giving me the opportunity to discuss it. So I'm not gonna, okay, so this. Okay, so. Okay, there we go. So I will not go over the paper again, but I want to outline the contribution and the strengths. So the contribution, I identify mainly two fronts in which this paper contributes. The first is to combine rich data on population and housing prices, as well as IB that leverages both push factor stocks and migrant networks, as well as a battery of robustness tests and checks of the IB that make these a credible identification strategy in order to show that there's a positive effect of migration on housing prices, which is a timely and important topic given the current discussion on housing affordability. And then the decomposition. This is quite important as well because it provides a novel method to study the impact of migration on host economies by understanding what is the role of the impact on the location choices of natives, and in particular by decomposing this total effect that we usually identify into the partial impact or the direct impact and the impact on native relocation. Is quite useful both for economics of migration, but it can also be applied in other settings, or it can potentially be applied to other settings. And importantly, it also outlines the importance of taking native mobility into account, which is something that in the economics of migration, it's quite relevant. And then in terms of the strengths of the paper, so the paper is very well written piece, well motivated. It's clear and engaging. I particularly like how easy it was to follow the exposition of the formal decomposition, and as well as the direct implementation, as is explained in the paper, how the formal decomposition is first laid out, and then Rosa goes over how to implement it empirically. Then also Rosa provides a battery of robustness checks that hold across different specifications, giving extra credibility to the specification. And then also, I think it's quite important to underline that these migrant networks, shift share IV, has been into severe criticism lately, but Rosa manages to overcome some of this criticism by using this push factor migrant network, so predicting the stocks of natives using a push factor sort of first stage, which then is shown to pass all the validity tests that we need for credible identification. So I think this is quite important, and it's the state-of-the-art methodology nowadays to use these IVs. So that's something that I really liked as well. And then in terms of some comments on the paper, so first of all, I think it will be interesting to look at within province heterogeneity or smaller geographical units. So Spain has around 8,000 municipalities across these 50 provinces, but of course, many of them are quite small. So around 100 of them, a little bit more, have more than 50,000 people. 300 of them have above 20,000 people. So it might be interesting to look at the heterogeneity amongst these areas for which data is easier, for which data is available, especially price house data that might be very noisy in smaller regions, in smaller municipalities. And so that will be interesting. Another possibility will be to focus on urban areas, as in the paper of De la Roca and Puga, or some municipalities. So there's another paper that looks at the effect on municipalities and finds no effect on large municipalities, but it uses a different methodology. So it will be interesting also to understand what is the difference between this Garcia Montalvo effect and yours. And then in terms of the time period, so there's both the boom and bust included. So the boost from 2018 to 2011, there was both a decrease in housing prices as well as migrant inflows. In fact, the average province lost population during this period. So another interesting avenue for future research will be to understand whether these effects are symmetric, both on the boost and the boom, which is also quite policy relevant. Then finally, okay, I went too fast. So then some comments on the mechanisms and implications. So I think it's quite interesting to look at native relocation, and I wonder which type of natives are relocating and whether they live in the same areas. Of course, with province level data, it's a bit difficult to do that, but maybe it will be nice to provide even some descriptive evidence on whether natives and immigrants collocate even within these provinces. And then can we expect to be complementarity across natives and immigrants in terms of where to move? So here I'm thinking about the Perry-Sparver framework, which in Spain has been shown to hold that natives specialize in more non-manual tasks, or it could be other types of native. Maybe we can think that maybe there's complementary in terms of age or some other dimension. Finally, in terms of house prices and the long-term increase that we observe in this paper, in another paper by Monraz that you cite, there's a decrease in house prices. And the mechanism there is that many migrants work in construction, ruining prices, while in this case, there's an increase. I think this might be due maybe to the bubble or some other mechanism operating in Spain. But it will also be interesting to understand what are the differences in the mechanisms in both Monraz and your paper. And finally, for future work and to open the floor to discussion, I think that the granular focus will be quite interesting to investigate further in future research, even also the special concentration of migrants. This might be less important in the case of Spain, where there's less spatial segregation, shown in the paper of Fernandez, Huertas Moragas, and co-authors, but it might could also be interesting, both to apply your decomposition and your framework to other countries. For instance, the US, which has been shown to have quite high levels of spatial aggregation, at least when compared to Spain. So these are some questions that I hope also promote more questions. And yeah, this is discussion, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Gabriel. Do you want to react very quickly, Rosa?
Yeah,
maybe
I will.
Very shortly, that we have a bit of time also for the discussion afterwards. Thank you.
Okay, great. So thank you, Gabi, for this great discussion, and I'm very glad that you like the paper. So first on the mechanisms, I didn't have time to go over it in the presentation. I had a hard time trying to understand why I found this quite substantial collocation of natives as immigrants. And in fact, I tried to kill it because referees were basically killing the paper because of this. There's this big idea that migrants have to push natives out. And there's, and I think in a small spatial scale is a very credible assumption, but however, I think the fact that I use a larger area doesn't, and this might be masking a lot of heterogeneity, as you've also been pointing out about the granularity of the data. I find this positive effect that had also been found in Spain in a slightly different type of study, and so I started looking at all these literature and Ottaviano on complementarity. So I have this kind of toy model in the paper where I basically claim that or I try to argue that immigrants provide cheap services to natives, and this is kind of a win-win situation. So that's driving the collocation. And I have some correlations in the paper where I show that in areas where immigrants have concentrated, there's a slower growth in the service sectors where immigrants work largely, like hospitality and care for elder people, etc., etc. So there's a bit of evidence on this direction in the paper. It's obviously limited because I don't know how many, I think Hem has some experience working, getting data for Spain is not great. There's a lot of data that's quite aggregated. And that takes me to your point on municipalities. So I do agree. At some point, I started working on this, and I was doing it at the province level. And I thought maybe I could do at the municipality level. Also, the dynamics there might be slightly smaller. We can think about what we consider to be a housing market. Is it a municipality, or we want something larger, like natives might locate in any municipality within a province if they consider this to be a kind of contained housing market. So yeah, there's something that can be done. I think the paper you mentioned from Jesus overlaps a bit on this, so I'm not sure. I think I might go there, but it's a good suggestion. And yeah, regarding Joan Monrat's paper, yeah, I have read this paper many times in sense to try to make sense why he finds a different effect. I think at the time of the housing boom in Spain, the cost, let's say the wage cost of the labor in housing was probably not a major contributor to price. I think in these terms, probably natives and immigrants were providing cheap labor in that sense, because the substitution of an immigrant is a low-skilled native. So I don't think the wage differences might be very different there. I do know that Joan finds this negative effect. I think it could just be because he has different housing markets, houses where they're like these kind of prefabricated houses that where the cost of labor is more important than the final price, while I think maybe in Spain it might not have been, but I don't really have an answer for that. And finally, on the boom and bust, fair point. I did think about it. The problem is that from the bust period, it's very difficult to make the instrument work because it's easier to predict where immigrants will locate based on ethnic networks, but there's no reason to think that they will live at the same rate based on ethnic networks. So I don't think the instrument works itself for the burst period. I did have a previous version of the paper where I stopped in 2009-10. So I didn't include many of the burst periods, and the results are very similar. So I don't know if I can really push the results over there, especially given that I only have 50 provinces. So maybe if I were to go to a smaller scale and a longer panel, something could be done. So I think there's room for future work on that area. So thank you for the discussion. It was very useful. And happy to hear your questions.
Thank you very much, Rosa. Any comments? I'll also, but let me first give the word to Anna, and then I'll also add a question, and maybe there's also somebody online. But Anna first.
Thank you, Rosa. Nice seeing you. I think we haven't seen each other in a while. So my question, well, obviously there's some underlying assumptions in the narrative here. I guess that we have to assume that most of the housing transactions are done by natives and not by immigrants. So I don't know if you show that in the paper, but I'm assuming here that
it is true. So there's two things I can point there. There's a survey in 2007 that was done, and I think there's the understanding that immigrants were not buying houses in Spain, but that's actually not true. There was a lot of immigrants buying houses in the boom period, but it is true that 70% of immigrants rent. So there's an effect. You can expect that house prices react to this anyway, because the houses might be being bought as an investment to rent to immigrants. There's obviously a discussion about immigrants renting on the informal market. I cannot do anything about that. But with the formal data, I think we can reconcile the fact that immigrants disproportionately rent, but through a kind of indirect effect on house prices. And secondly, I do have a lot of, so I didn't have much time. So my idea to interpret these coefficient of demand effects relies on conditioning out supply conditions. So there's a lot of discussion in the paper about consumption patterns by immigrants and natives, and changes in the density of housing in provinces that had high immigration versus low immigration. And I find that actually there's not that many changes, so the fixed effects can control for a lot of these changes in the patterns of a concentration of density of consumption. And I also control by the fact that housing tenure and housing occupancy might be different for natives and immigrants with a flexible time trend. So I think some of these concerns are controlled for in the empirical specification.
Right.
Thank you, Anna.
The second part of my question, sorry if I can. I lost the thread a bit on the underlying mechanism that would make, let's say, natives flee areas of immigration. I understand that a small scale like neighborhoods, segregation maybe becomes too homogeneous, or, the homophilia type of argument that I'm not a big fan of. But then on a regional scale, the mechanism that drives this disproportionate mobility wasn't entirely clear to me in the argumentation. So if you can come back to explain what might drive people to flee this area.
I have to say, this is an empirical result. There's not so much I can do about mechanisms. So what I did instead is to try to go at the literature, and there's this abundant literature by Ottaviano and Perry mostly that tried to kind of counter-argue on this Borjas instrument that immigrants are bad and this kind of thing. So he shows, and there's been papers also for Spain at Karen, that immigrants and natives tend to specialize on different tasks. Actually, they might have complementarities in production and in